Hey, good morning, Horizon Church. Welcome to Wednesday of what we call Holy Week, and we are walking through the event this week, not in order. Can't do that really. There's just way too much that went on this week, as we've talked about the last couple days. So we're really jumping around, and I apologize for that. Tomorrow on Thursday, we'll actually be able to look at the events kind of in order when we do this. But walk through the Gospel of John, and good morning, Estella, and looking at some of the events of this week, because there's a lot of events recorded in the Gospels. I want to pick up kind of where we left off. Had a friend show up this morning, which is really cool. Had somebody come in I haven't seen for a while. I don't get to see a whole lot. So had a chance to talk to him, and did not really get to look at what I wanted to look at here this morning, but that's all right. Rather spend time with a friend. So John chapter 19, I want to look at. This is really an account of the ongoing trial, the back and forth that goes on with Jesus between Pilate, Herod, the Jews, etc. So starting right at the beginning of John chapter 19, it says that Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. Let me just stop there for just a second. There's in Roman law, there were three levels of a flogging that could take place. The first level, the least severe, was the kind of flogging when you have somebody who just needs to learn a lesson. You just need to, the Romans would need to beat him up a little bit, make him pay, make him suffer. It was not in any way an easy thing to go through. It talked about a lead-tipped whip. But there were two other levels of flogging, and I don't have the Roman words or the Greek words for those, but the third level of flogging is the most severe. This is when a person has been already condemned to death, somebody who's already condemned to be crucified. And this would be a horrifically brutal flogging. It's possible that you won't even survive this flogging. At this stage, this first flogging of Pilate, and John only tells us about one. Good morning, Marianne. John only tells us about one flogging, but the word that's used here is for the least severe at this point. The flogging that Pilate subjects Jesus to at this point is the one where it's like, I need to teach a bad guy a lesson. I need to beat him up, I need to make him hurt, I need to make him look bad. And look like he's brutalized, but I don't need to kill him. Now, there's a second flogging that Jesus will endure, and that's the third level. And if we kind of, summarize all the Gospels and form a synopsis of the Gospels, in Mark chapter 15, I don't know the verse, 15, 16, somewhere in there, Jesus is subjected to another flogging, and it's this third one, and John, when Jesus is handed over to be crucified, he's subjected again. He's now condemned to death. John doesn't tell us about that, but that's a second one. This first one that Pilate's subjected to is the first level. So Jesus is beaten, flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. Probably it was a robe from one of the Roman soldiers who were there. So they're doing everything they can really to mock Jesus. A crown of thorns, a robe. "Hail, King of the Jews," they mocked as they slapped him across the face. Pilate went outside again to the people. If you remember, the Jewish leaders would not come inside because it would have made them unclean. They would not have been able to celebrate Passover. So Pilate has to go back in and out to deal with the Jews. Pilate goes outside again. He said to the Jews, to the people, "I'm going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly, I find him not guilty." I mean, you sense Pilate's frustration at this point. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Here is the man." It's a very famous statement. Here's the man. And by this point, Jesus would have looked brutalized. He's standing there, having been beaten up, uh, repeatedly slapped, hit. The flogging would have been over, so he'd be a bloody mess. He has this crown of thorns pushed down on his head, and he's wearing this purple robe. So he would have looked pitiful, beaten, and Pilate said, "Here he is. Here's the man." When they saw him, the leading priests and temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate, the way that this is phrased, this next sentence, it's phrased in a kind of disgusted way. Pilate's at the end of his rope with these people, and he says, "If you want to crucify him, then you do it." That's in essence what he means. You're responsible. You go do this. He says, "Take him yourself and crucify him." Pilate says, I don't find him guilty. I find him not guilty." The Jewish leaders replied, "By our law, he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." It's a charge of blasphemy, is in essence what they're getting at. And, you can, some of the scholars who work through this story will say, they'll look at this charge and they'll read Jewish law and try to find out, is it really against the law to claim to be the Son of God? I mean, there's all kinds of Old Testament references to such things. A claim of blasphemy certainly is in Jewish Old Testament law. It is a capital offense. But so that's where they seem to be heading, that this man before them has blasphemed. When Pilate heard this is interesting. When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. Pilate would have been very much a typical superstitious Roman. The Romans had this conviction, as they had this pantheon of gods, and everybody struggles today. We struggle a little bit with, what the average Roman really believe about the gods. There definitely, at this particular time, there definitely was this inclination towards a kind of atheism among what you would think of as upper class Romans. They just it seems as if they weren't so inclined to believe the old myths and the old stories about the gods. But many Romans, many of the Romans we also know they were superstitious in the sense that they believed that every once in a while the gods could just screw around with humans. They could show up and they could fiddle around with humans, and they could orchestrate just rotten events for humans that had fallen out of favor with them. So that's what seems to be going on. And you may remember from one of the Gospels too, where Pilate's wife had warned him about a dream she had about this man. And so Pilate is really uneasy, especially because in his questioning of Jesus, he doesn't find any antagonism from Jesus. He finds no reason to condemn him to death. So he hears this. He hears these Jews say that this man is calling himself a son of the gods, a son of God. And Pilate, being superstitious, becomes really more and more scared of his involvement with Jesus. And he's doing everything in his, kind of corrupt power to not have to condemn this man to death. So, verse 9, he took Jesus back into headquarters again, and he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" The immediate follow-up to that question, to that accusation that this man has been saying he's the son of the gods. Pilate says, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Pilate demanded, "Why don't you talk to me? Don't you realize I have the power to release you or crucify you?" In other words, Pilate saying, "I have the power of death over you. Don't you know that?" And this is one of those statements of Jesus that follows. It's just amazing to me when Jesus says, "You don't have any power here. You think you do, you don't." you would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. And this is interesting. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. In essence, what Jesus is saying to Pilate is that your ability to have me crucified, you only have it because from above, it's been given to you, that you really are in essence, you're part of the plan. But then Jesus says this statement: the one who is guilty of the greater sin is the one who handed me over to you. I always used to think that that was Judas. When Jesus said that, I always thought that Jesus was talking about the betrayal of Judas, and I am pretty sure that that's not the case now. The more I read about what Jewish legal scholars, as well as biblical scholars, have to say about what's going on here. Um, when you look at the Jewish law and what's happening, um, Judas is pretty much out of the story at this point. He's not the focus anymore. Judas has his role is done. He really doesn't appear in the story. The one who handed Jesus over to Pilate is Caiaphas, the Jewish religious leaders, the high priest's family. He's the one who's handed Jesus over. And so in essence, what Jesus is acknowledging at this point, he's acknowledging the Jewish rejection of him as the Messiah. It's now official. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that the Jewish leaders, represented by Caiaphas, the high priests in that circle of influence, they're the ones who have handed me over to you. So that's who Jesus is talking about. And he's in essence saying they're guilty of a greater sin because of the rejection of him. Verse 12, then Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Jewish leaders shouted. This is fascinating. The Jewish leaders shouted to Pilate, if you release this man, you are, quote, no friend of Caesar. That's actually a title. They're not just saying, it's not just a phrase they pull out of the air. The Caesars had an official title, kind of an official position. To be friend of Caesar meant that you were somebody who received the Caesar's favor. You were someone who was recognized as on Caesar's side. There were some particular Caesars who really were pretty brutal guys who, if you fell out of favor, if you became someone who was no longer a friend of Caesar, your life was in danger and you could easily be executed. And it happened at multiple times. And here's the thing, Pilate knew the history of the Jews. And I don't have time to review all this. I didn't get to, brush up on my history, but there are multiple times when Jewish leaders would travel to Rome to complain about the governors or the men who had been appointed as kings. Some of you will remember, various sermons, lessons, talking about Herod. When Herod traveled to Rome, Herod the Great, not the Herod who's alive now, Herod the Great, the Herod who was king when Jesus was born. He had traveled to Rome. He was a friend of Mark Antony. That Herod had children with Cleopatra, as we understand it. And there's a war between Caesar and Mark Antony. Mark Antony lost. That Herod the Great, traveled to Rome, and he asked the Roman Senate, to be appointed to use the title King of the Jews. And the Jewish leaders did not want this. The Jewish leaders did not want Herod to be king. So a delegation of 70 of them traveled to Rome to protest Herod's being declared king. So this was not unusual. It would not be out of the question for Jewish leaders to travel to Rome to complain about a governor. So they're saying to Pilate here, they're saying, if you don't execute this man, if you don't follow through with our wishes, if you don't have him crucified, you are no friend of Caesar. They're using an official title there. They're playing a political game, and they're saying Caesar's going to find out. He will find out. He will know that you did not execute this man, because this man is claiming to be a king, a rebel against Caesar. So verse 13, when they said this, when these Jewish leaders said, if you don't do this, you're no friend of Caesar. When they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them again. Then Pilate sat down on the judgment seat on the platform that is called the stone pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was now about noon. So, it's time references are particularly tricky, because they didn't say noon. They said the third hour, second hour, the first hour, etc. And hours were shortened or longer depending on the season of the year. An hour wasn't 60 minutes. It was now about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover. And Pilate said to the people, "Look, here is your king." And they yelled, away with him, crucify him. What? Pilate asked, crucify your king? And they say, we have no king but Caesar. An astonishing statement by the Jewish leaders. We have no king but Caesar. The leading priest shouted back. And then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. So we're going to stop there for today. But just an incredible story about what Jesus went through. And he's about to be taken to the cross. So tomorrow we'll get caught up. On Friday we'll talk about Jesus on the cross. But these are the events that led to the cross. But what's so important here, I think, in this story is not only the treatment of Jesus and the political struggle that's going on between the Jews and the Romans, between Pilate and the leading priests, the chief priests who are identified here. And the fact that this is the moment when their rejection of Jesus is completely solidified. The Gospel of John starts out this way. In John chapter 1, when John introduces us to Jesus, John talks about the fact that Jesus came as a man. And I love this phrase, one of my favorite phrases. Jesus came full of grace and truth. Just such a wonderful description of Jesus. And when you look at how John tells us about Jesus, that's what Jesus was. Jesus was a man who always told the truth, 100% truthful, and yet 100% gracious, full of grace and truth. That's why people responded to Jesus. People who are able to do that are a gift to the world. Most of us aren't able to do that. Most of us go one way or another. We're either gracious and, we're not always truthful. We're people pleasers. Or we're truthful and we're obnoxious with it. But Jesus was someone who was full of grace and truth, 100% both, all truth and all grace in a package, in this extraordinary man, this extraordinary human being. And the broken world responded to that. But John also said in that opening chapter, he says, he came to his own, and his own received him not, his own rejected him. That's how Jesus is introduced to us in John chapter 1, a man full of grace and truth who came to his own people, and his own people rejected him. And over the years, to be honest with you, there's a whole lot of anti-Semitism that's been directed because, of this ugly accusation that it was the Jews who crucified Jesus. And certainly the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus, but there's no justification for anti-Semitism in saying that. But that's what's happening here. The Jewish leaders, the high priests, officially reject Jesus as their king, as their leader, and it's now official. They have sided with Rome, and they have said, we have no king but Caesar. It's an incredibly sad statement. No king but Caesar. And they get their way by saying to Pilate, by threatening Pilate, if you don't crucify him, if you don't do what we ask, you are, quote, no friend of Caesar. And they were letting Pilate know, Caesar will hear about this. Pilate is between a rock and a hard place. It's not to justify what he did. But Pilate recognizes the dilemma he's in. He's superstitious, worried about what's going on. but he caves, he gives in, and he will hand Jesus over to be crucified. So that's where we are in this story, walking through this. We've arrived at the moment when the Jewish leaders make it official. Their rejection of Jesus as Messiah is now official, and the Romans will carry out a crucifixion. It's ultimately the Romans who will crucify Jesus. They're the ones with the authority to do it. They're the ones with the brutality to do it, and we will see them. We've already seen them in this little episode. We've seen their brutality, and it will get worse. It will get much worse. But yeah, so that's today's little wandering through the episodes of Holy Week. I know we're out of order, but just to cover some territory, it was necessary to do that. Tomorrow, on Thursday, we will kind of line up with the events of what's going on. But let me say a prayer for us, and then we can all get on with our days. Father, it's horrific to think about the events that transpired this weekend, to read one more time about, I guess, what we call man's inhumanity to man, how willing we can be to see other people suffer. And I cannot understand the willingness of people to do what they do to other human beings, but it was done to Jesus on our behalf. One more time, God, I thank you for the love which compelled you to act in this way. I don't understand it. I can't fathom the math that transpires, but clearly, God, you make it obvious that this was done for us to win our forgiveness, to conquer death, and to bring about the empty tomb. Thank you, God, for Jesus, who agonized in the garden and then was willing to follow through with your will and to walk into these horrific events. We're humble, God, and we are grateful. And I pray, Father, that as we go through this day, as we walk through the events of this week, that more and more we would be reminded of what was accomplished for us. And even when we can't understand the gravity of it, we can still be grateful, Father, to you for what was done. So I pray, God, that you be with us all day. We don't have to ask you to do that. You desire to be with us. Thank you. And I pray, Father, that we would be humbly grateful for the idea that we get to go through a day with you every day. Every person we see, we get to look at them through your eyes, through the eyes of Jesus. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. And we will see you tomorrow here at 9 o'clock.